The rain fell in a fine, persistent mist, a gray veil that blurred the edges of the world and turned the Blackwood Crest Cemetery into a watercolor painting of grief. It clung to the ancient oaks, dripping from their skeletal November branches onto the manicured grass and polished granite. A black Bentley, silent as a phantom, waited by the wrought iron gates, its engine a low, respectful purr against the quiet hiss of the rain. Victoria Blackwood stood before the mausoleum, a structure of white marble so pure and imposing it seemed to defy the somber landscape. It was less a tombstone and more a temple, a monument, not just to the son she had lost, but to the dynasty he was meant to lead. The name etched in elegant, deep-cut letters above the heavy bronze doors was simple, yet it carried the weight of an empire, Adrian Blackwood. Below it, the dates that bracketed a life cut short felt like a personal affront to her, an error in the universe's accounting that she could never rectify. At 55, Victoria was a woman forged in the crucible of corporate warfare, her features as impeccably structured and unforgiving as the skyscrapers that housed her global enterprise, Blackwood Industries. Her tailored cashmere coat repelled the damp, its dark charcoal color a stark contrast to the bouquet of white lilies she held in her gloved hands. 3 years. 3 years since the phone call that had shattered her meticulously ordered world. 3 years of a grief that was sharp, proprietary, and cold. A grief not for the warmth of a lost son, but for the fracturing of a perfect legacy. Adrian had been her masterpiece, the culmination of generations of wealth and power, and his death was a flaw in the design she could not tolerate. She visited on the anniversary not out of sentimental need, but out of a sense of duty, a ritual to reaffirm her loss and her solitude. This place was hers. This grief was hers. The memory of her son was hers to command, to polish, to preserve in the amber of her own narrative. That was why the sight of them felt like a physical blow, a violation of a sacred space. Standing directly before Adrian's tomb, their backs to her were two figures, a woman and a small child. The woman was slender, wrapped in a thin, pale blue uniform that was clearly inadequate for the weather. It was the uniform of a waitress from a diner, the kind of establishment Victoria had only ever observed from the tinted windows of her car. The fabric was darkening in patches where the rain had soaked through. She held the hand of a little boy no older than 4, who was bundled in a jacket a size too big for him. They were both still, their heads bowed, two small, insignificant figures against the immense white marble of the mausoleum. Victoria's first reaction was not curiosity, but a surge of pure, unadulterated fury. Trespassers. This was a private cemetery, and the Blackwood plot was the most secluded, most sacrosanct part of it. Who were these people? Sympathy seekers, ghoulish tourists, drawn to the tragedy of a wealthy family. The thought was vulgar. Her gloved fingers tightened on the stems of the lilies, the delicate stalks threatening to snap. She moved forward, her heels sinking slightly into the soft, damp earth, the sound swallowed by the rain. She did not try to be quiet. She wanted them to feel her approach, to feel the weight of her authority bearing down on them. As she drew closer, she could hear the woman speaking, her voice, a low, soothing murmur nearly lost in the wind. Then she heard another sound, a small hiccuping sob from the child. They were crying at her son's grave. The audacity of it stole Victoria's breath. "Excuse me." Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with the chilling precision of a scalpel. The woman flinched as if struck, her shoulders tensing. She turned slowly, her hand instinctively pulling the child closer, shielding him slightly behind her leg. The woman was black, her skin the color of rich coffee, her features fine and weary. Her eyes, red-rimmed and swollen, widened slightly. As she took in the sight of Victoria, the expensive coat, the severe expression, the aura of absolute power that clung to her like a shroud. There was a moment of stunned silence, the rain the only sound between them. "This is a private moment." Victoria stated her tone, leaving no room for negotiation. She took another step, deliberately placing herself between them and the tomb, reclaiming her territory. "You are in the wrong place." The young woman swallowed, her throat working. She wiped at her wet cheeks with the back of her hand, a gesture of such raw, unpracticed sorrow it was almost offensive to Victoria's controlled world. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling but clear. I didn't know anyone was coming today. We were just leaving." Victoria's gaze was dismissive, sweeping over the worn uniform, the cheap shoes peeking out from beneath the child's oversized coat. Everything about them screamed of a life she knew nothing about, a life of struggle and insignificance. "Who are you?" she demanded, her business instincts kicking in, categorizing and assessing the threat. "And why are you crying at my son's grave? Did you know him?" The question was a test. She had reviewed every known associate, friend, and acquaintance of Adrian's after his death. This woman was not on any list. The waitress, this stranger, hesitated. Her gaze flickered from Victoria's face to the name on the tomb, and then down to the child beside her. It was a look of profound, heart-wrenching conflict. "My name is Jasmine Washington," she said finally, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "And this is Tyler. I work at Bell's Diner. I come here sometimes. Adrian. He was important to us." The name of her son on this woman's lips felt like another desecration. Important. How could Adrian, her Adrian, who moved through circles of international finance and Ivy League prestige, be important to a waitress from a roadside diner? The story didn't fit. It was a lie, a clumsy attempt to insert herself into a tragedy that did not belong to her. Important how Victoria pressed, her voice dropping, becoming colder, more dangerous. The rain was falling harder now, plastering stray strands of Jasmine's dark hair to her temples. But neither of them seemed to notice. The world had narrowed to the space between them, a battlefield of wet grass and cold stone. Jasmine's eyes met hers. In their depths beneath the grief, Victoria saw something unexpected, a spark of defiance, of fierce protective courage. It was the look of a mother defending her young. "He was a good man," Jasmine said simply, as if that explained everything. Victoria almost laughed. It was such a common plebeian sentiment. Goodness had little currency in her world. Results, power, influence, those were the metrics of a man's worth. Adrian had possessed all of them in spades. This woman knew nothing. She was about to deliver a final dismissive command for them to leave, to vanish from her sight and her memory, when the child Tyler shifted from behind his mother's leg. He turned his head and looked up, not at the imposing marble tomb, but directly at Victoria. And the world stopped. It wasn't a sudden halt, but a slow, grinding cessation of everything. The sound of the rain faded. The chill in the air vanished. The scent of wet earth and lilies disappeared. All that existed for Victoria in that single eternal moment was the child's face and his eyes. They were green. Not just green, but a specific luminous shade of emerald flecked with gold. They were eyes that held an impossible, soul-shattering familiarity. They were the eyes she saw in her own reflection every morning in her gilded mirror. They were the eyes she had gazed into as she rocked her infant son to sleep 3 decades ago. They were Adrian's eyes. Victoria's mind, a fortress of logic and control, fractured. It scrambled for an explanation, for a reason, for anything other than the impossible truth that was staring her in the face. It was a coincidence, a trick of the light, a genetic anomaly. But the denial was a thin, brittle shield, and the reality was a battering ram. The shape of his face, the slight upturn of his nose, the stubborn set of his small chin, it was all an echo, a miniature, heart-stopping replica of the boy she had raised. Her breath hitched in her throat. She felt a dizzying, terrifying vertigo, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had turned to mist. Her meticulously constructed reality, the one in which she was the sole keeper of Adrian's legacy, was crumbling to dust. She tore her gaze from the child and fixed it on Jasmine. Her own eyes, normally weapons of intimidation, were now wide with a desperate, unspoken question. She could not force the words out. Her throat was a knot of ice. Jasmine saw the recognition in Victoria's face. She saw the shock, the dawning horror, the complete implosion of a powerful woman's world. The tears that had been drying on Jasmine's cheeks began to fall anew. But these were different. They were tears of resignation, of a burden finally shared. She drew the boy closer, her hand resting protectively on his head. She looked directly into Victoria Blackwood's soul-stricken eyes, and with a courage that seemed to draw from the very center of the earth, she gave voice to the truth that had just ripped through the fabric of reality. "Because Tyler is his son." The bouquet slipped from Victoria's numb fingers. The perfect white lilies, symbols of a pure, unbroken line, scattered across the cold, wet stone of the grave, their petals instantly bruised and sullied by the mud. 3 years of mourning a legacy she believed had ended. 3 years only to discover it had been alive all along, hidden away in a world she had never deigned to notice. And in that moment, the rain felt less like a veil of sorrow and more like the first drops of a coming hurricane. The drive back from the cemetery was a silent, hermetically sealed journey through a world that had lost its sharp edges. Victoria did not weep. Her shock had already crystallized into something harder, colder, and far more dangerous resolve. The bruised lilies lay forgotten on the plush floor mat of the Bentley, a disregarded testament to the moment her reality had been cleaved in two. Her mind, a finely tuned instrument of strategy and acquisition, was already processing the new data, discarding grief as an inefficient variable and focusing on a singular overriding objective: control. A child existed. A grandson. Her blood. Adrienne's blood. This fact, which an hour ago would have been impossible, was now the central axis around which her world turned. But he was in the wrong hands, a priceless asset languishing in obscurity. His existence an untidy secret that threatened the immaculate narrative of the Blackwood legacy. This would not stand. Before the Bentley had even purred to a stop in the subterranean garage of her penthouse, she had her phone to her ear. It rang only once. "David," she said, her voice devoid of any emotion. There was no need for pleasantries. David Chun had been her executive assistant, her fixer, her shadow, her unwavering right hand for 15 years. He understood her silences better than most men understood declarations of love. "Yes, Victoria," his voice came back calm and ready. "I have a priority task. I am sending you a name, Jasmine Washington, and a child, Tyler, approximately 4 years old. I want to know everything. I want to know the brand of soap she uses, the last book she checked out of the library, the names of every person she has spoken to in the last 3 years. I want her life, David, every mundane, miserable detail of it on my desk by morning. Find every address, every paycheck, every debt. And I want to know definitively who Tyler's mother was. There is no official record. Find out why. Use any resource. There is no budget. Consider it done." David said the 2 words of familiar comfort, a promise of order restored. Victoria disconnected, stepping out of the car into the pristine silence of the garage. The problem had been identified, the first step towards a solution initiated. This was a hostile takeover, not of a company, but of a life. And Victoria Blackwood had never lost one yet. By 10 the next morning, a sleek, leather-bound dossier lay on the vast expanse of her mahogany desk. Her office, occupying the entire top floor of the Blackwood Industries tower, was a testament to minimalist power. The floor-to-ceiling windows presented the city below as a map of her own, making a kingdom viewed from the heavens. David stood silently by the window as she read his presence as unobtrusive and necessary as the air she breathed. The report was exactly what she had expected, and yet it was deeply unsettling. Jasmine Washington's life was a portrait of quiet desperation. 26 years old, an orphan raised by an aunt in a different state, no criminal record, no social media presence. She worked 60 hours a week, split between the early breakfast shift at Bell's Diner and a late-night cleaning job at a downtown law firm. Her income was laughably meager. Her apartment was a single-bedroom unit in a crumbling brick building in a part of town Victoria's driver actively avoided. The details were grimly fascinating. A library card showed a preference for legal textbooks and biographies of powerful women. A bank statement showed every spare dollar going towards rent utilities and a small, consistent payment to a children's clothing store. She was poor, but she was organized. She was struggling, but she was surviving with a methodical discipline that Victoria could almost respect. Then there was the section on Tyler, born 4 years ago. No hospital records under Jasmine Washington's name. No birth certificate could be found for a Tyler Washington born in the state. The private investigators had hit a wall of official non-existence. It was as if the child had simply appeared in Jasmine's life. "His biological mother is a ghost," David commented softly, anticipating her question. "We've cross-referenced every Jane Doe birth in the tri-state area for that time period. Nothing. It's as if she never existed." Victoria tapped a perfectly manicured nail on a grainy photograph of Tyler. He was on a swing in a dreary public park, laughing, his face tilted towards the sun, and his eyes, even in the poor-quality image, blazed with that familiar emerald fire. Her grandson, living in squalor, mothered by a ghost and raised by a waitress. The untidiness of it all was an affront to her very being. She is hiding something, Victoria murmured more to herself than to David. Or she is simply what she appears to be, David offered. A young woman who took in a child and is doing her best. Victoria looked up at him, her blue eyes like chips of ice. No one, David, is ever simply what they appear to be. Schedule a meeting with Miss Washington. Here, my office, 2 o'clock today. Jasmine arrived at 2 precisely. She wore what was clearly her best outfit, a simple navy blue dress purchased from a thrift store and sensible flat shoes. She carried no purse. Her hands were empty, her posture straight, her head held high as she walked across the acres of Italian marble in the lobby. She did not gawk at the soaring atrium or the priceless modern art on the walls. She moved with a purpose and a strange, quiet dignity that seemed utterly out of place, yet unshakable. When she was shown into Victoria's office, the calculated display of power was overwhelming. The cityscape unfolded behind Victoria's desk like a conquered territory. The air was cool and smelled faintly of leather and money. Victoria gestured to a single armless chair positioned in front of her desk. It was a piece of modernist furniture that was both beautiful and deeply uncomfortable, and it was set intentionally lower than her own high-backed leather throne. "Sit down, Miss Washington," Victoria said, her voice smooth and polished. Jasmine looked at the chair, then at Victoria. She remained standing. "I'd rather stand, thank you." A flicker of annoyance crossed Victoria's face, but she masked it instantly. "As you wish." She opened the dossier on her desk, though she had already committed every word to memory. "I've had you looked into." "I imagined you would," Jasmine replied, her voice steady. "2 jobs, no savings. An apartment that by all accounts is unsuitable for a child." Victoria continued, her words like stones being dropped one by one. "You are barely keeping your head above water." "Tyler is loved," Jasmine said, her voice unwavering. "He is safe, he is healthy, and he is happy. He is well cared for." Victoria offered a smile that was all technique and no warmth. "I have no doubt you do your best. But a Blackwood child deserves more than your best. He deserves the absolute best. The best money can buy the best opportunities in the world, the future his father would have wanted for him." She let the words hang in the air, a vision of private schools, Swiss tutors, and summers in the Mediterranean. Then she executed the move she had been planning all morning. She opened a drawer and produced a cashier's check, sliding it across the vast polished surface of the desk. The numbers on it were obscene. $200,000, Victoria said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "To start a new life, anywhere you want, a clean break. Tyler comes to live with me where he belongs. He will be raised with every advantage. You will be provided for, of course. We can arrange for supervised visits, weekends, holidays. It's a generous offer. The most sensible solution for everyone." Jasmine stared at the check. She did not look at it with awe or temptation, but with an expression of profound, almost pitying disgust. It was as if Victoria had laid a dead rat on the desk between them. "Are you trying to buy my son?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. The civility in Victoria's demeanor began to fray. "He is not your son," she snapped, her tone hardening. "He is my grandson. He is blood of my blood. And frankly, a 26-year-old waitress with no prospects cannot offer him a fraction of what a family like ours can. Family." Jasmine's laugh was a short, bitter sound that echoed unnervingly in the silent office. "You want to talk about family, Victoria? For 3 years, Tyler has called me Mama. I'm the one who holds him when he has nightmares about monsters under his bed. I'm the one who teaches him his letters at our small kitchen table. I'm the one who reads him stories until he falls asleep. That is family. It is not something you can purchase." Victoria stood up, her height and the power of her position creating an intimidating presence. She walked around the desk to stand before Jasmine. "Those are noble sentiments, Miss Washington, but they don't pay the rent. You work like a slave just to survive. Tyler deserves private schools in New England, not a struggling inner-city daycare. He deserves to travel the world, not just the 2 blocks to the public park. He deserves opportunities you can never give him. And he deserves unconditional love." Jasmine retorted, her eyes flashing with a sudden fire. "Something you clearly didn't give your own son." The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the air from the room. Victoria felt the words like a physical slap. The blood drained from her face, then rushed back in a hot, furious tide. "How dare you?" she whispered. Adrienne told me about you. Jasmine continued, her voice low, but cutting each word precise. He told me about the board meetings you chose over his school plays, the football games you never attended, the birthdays where you sent expensive gifts delivered by your assistants because you were closing a deal in Tokyo. You don't want Tyler because you care about him. You want him because he's a second chance, a way to fix your mistakes and soothe your guilty conscience. Victoria's hands clenched into fists at her sides. You know nothing about me. No, Jasmine conceded. But I knew your son, and I know exactly why he never told you about Tyler. With a swift, deliberate movement, Jasmine reached forward, picked up the check, and tore it in half. Then she tore the halves into quarters. The pieces of paper representing a life-altering sum of money fluttered down to the priceless Persian rug like dead leaves. Tyler is not for sale, she said. Victoria's face was a mask of cold fury. The pretense was over. Then we will do this the hard way, she said, her voice taking on a lethal edge. I have resources you cannot possibly imagine. I will hire the best lawyers in the country. They will bury you in legal fees. I will have investigators pick apart every second of your life. We will go to court and I will prove that a single uneducated woman living in poverty is an unfit guardian for a Blackwood heir. I will take him, Miss Washington. Make no mistake about that. Jasmine smiled. It was the first time she had smiled since entering the office, and the sight of it was deeply unsettling. It was not a smile of amusement, but of grim, confident certainty. It was the smile of someone who held a winning hand and was just waiting for the right moment to play it. Victoria, she said, her voice suddenly soft, almost gentle. You assume I'm just a poor waitress you can intimidate with your money and your threats. She took a small step back towards the door. But there are things about me, about Tyler, about Adrienne that your investigators haven't found. Secrets they would never think to look for. She paused at the door, her eyes locking with Victoria's. When you find out what they are, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, you will understand that your investigators are not nearly as good as you think they are. She turned and walked out, closing the door softly behind her. Victoria stood frozen in the center of her magnificent office, the silence ringing in her ears. The torn pieces of the check lay at her feet, a monument to her failure. For the first time in her adult life, a negotiation had not gone her way. She had made an offer, an overwhelming, life-changing offer, and it had been thrown back in her face with contempt. More than that, she had been challenged, threatened, by a woman who should have been trembling with fear. What secrets could a waitress possibly hold? What card could she possibly have to play that would render all of Victoria's immense power irrelevant? A cold knot of unease began to form in her stomach. It was an unfamiliar feeling, and she did not like it. For the first time in a very, very long time, Victoria Blackwood felt as though she was no longer the one in control. For a long time after Jasmine Washington left, Victoria remained motionless, a statue of ice and fury in the heart of her glass-walled kingdom. The torn pieces of the check on the floor were an offense, a flag of rebellion planted in the center of her dominion. The quiet confidence in the waitress's final words echoed in the silent, temperature-controlled air, a lingering poison. Secrets they would never think to look for. The audacity was breathtaking. But Victoria Blackwood had not built an empire on emotional reactions. Rage was a resource, an energy to be channeled, not an indulgence. She took a deep, steadying breath, the chill of the recycled air cooling the heat in her veins. She turned and walked back to her desk, her movements precise and controlled. She pressed an intercom button. David have housekeeping deal with the refuse on the floor. She said, her voice a calm, dangerous monotone. Then get Richard Thornton on the line for me, now. Richard Thornton had been Victoria's personal and corporate counsel for 20 years. He was a man of 60, with a mind like a steel trap and a demeanor so placid it was unnerving. He had guided her through hostile takeovers, navigated complex international regulations, and discreetly handled the few personal scandals that had dared to touch the Blackwood name. He was in short a man who understood power and how to legally apply it. When his voice, smooth as aged whiskey, came through the speakerphone, Victoria did not waste time. Richard, I have a situation that requires your immediate and undivided attention. It is a family law matter. She laid out the facts with brutal, emotionless efficiency, the discovery at the cemetery, the existence of a 4-year-old grandson named Tyler, and the boy's current guardian, an indigent waitress named Jasmine Washington. She omitted the more dramatic details of their confrontation, framing it instead as a business negotiation that had reached an impasse. "The woman is an unsuitable guardian," Victoria concluded. "She lives in poverty, has no familial support, and the child's very existence is shrouded in secrecy with no official birth records. He is my son's heir. He is a Blackwood. I want full sole and immediate custody." On the other end of the line, Richard was silent for a moment, processing. "Victoria Family Court can be unpredictable," he said cautiously. "Judges can be swayed by sentiment. A single woman who has cared for a child for 3 years, they will see her as a sympathetic figure regardless of her financial status." "Sentiment is a weakness for the unprepared," Victoria countered sharply. "We are not unprepared. I want you to assemble your best litigation team. I want them to use everything we have. Her financial instability, the substandard living conditions, the mystery surrounding the child's birth. Frame it as a rescue. We are rescuing a Blackwood from a life of neglect and uncertainty. I want petitions filed by the end of the day. I want her served by morning. I want this to be fast, overwhelming, and absolute. Drown her in paperwork. Bleed her dry before she can even find a lawyer she can afford. Spare no expense." "I understand," Richard said, the caution in his voice replaced by the familiar tone of a general receiving his marching orders. "We'll begin immediately. We can file for an emergency temporary custody order based on the instability of her living situation." "Do it," Victoria commanded and cut the connection. A sense of order, however fragile, began to return. This was familiar territory. The law, in her experience, was not a set of sacred principles. It was a complex system of levers and pressure points. With enough money and the right kind of leverage, one could make the machine do almost anything. Jasmine Washington had no money and therefore no leverage. She was an amateur who had made a foolishly emotional stand against a professional. The war had begun, and Victoria had just launched a nuclear strike. For the next 48 hours, she immersed herself in her work, the familiar rhythm of board meetings and billion-dollar decisions a soothing balm to her fractured peace. She reviewed quarterly reports, approved a new acquisition in the tech sector, and eviscerated a junior executive who presented flawed market projections. She was in command, untouchable. Her legal team reported that the petitions had been filed. A process server had been dispatched. It was only a matter of time. In her quieter moments, she allowed her thoughts to drift to the boy, Tyler. She had David procure architectural plans for the east wing of her penthouse. The 3 guest suites could be converted into a magnificent nursery, a playroom and rooms for a live-in nanny and a private tutor. She spent an hour reviewing the admissions criteria for the country's most elite preschools. The Blackwood name, of course, would open any door. She was not just planning to take custody of a child. She was planning the onboarding of a new CEO, albeit one who was still in diapers. This was not a grandson to be loved. He was a legacy to be secured. The call from Richard Thornton came late on the second afternoon. Victoria was reviewing satellite images of a potential mining site in Argentina when her private line chimed. The server was successful. Richard began, but his voice was tight, strained. The usual placid confidence was gone. It was the first sign that something was wrong. And Victoria prompted, her eyes still on the topographical map on her screen. She refused to be intimidated. She accepted the papers and told the server her legal counsel would be in touch. Victoria allowed herself a small, mirthless smile. Her legal counsel. I imagine that will be some overworked, underqualified public defender. He'll take one look at our filing and advise her to settle for whatever we offer. No, Victoria, Richard said, and the gravity in his voice made her finally look away from the screen. That's not what happened. He paused, and she could hear the faint rustle of paper over the line. An hour ago, my office received a notice of representation from her attorneys. And who are they? She asked, a touch of impatience in her voice. Some local ambulance-chasing firm. Richard took a deep breath. The firm is Morrison, Caldwell and Pierce. The name landed in the silent office with the force of a physical impact. Victoria went still. Even she, who operated in the stratosphere of corporate law, knew that name. Morrison, Caldwell and Pierce were not just lawyers. They were legends. They were giant killers, a firm that took on seemingly impossible civil rights cases, battled corrupt corporations, and championed the disenfranchised. They rarely lost. Their partners were legal scholars. Their associates were the top graduates from Harvard and Yale, and their cases made national headlines. They were, to put it mildly, the last people on earth you wanted to see on the other side of a courtroom. "That's impossible." Victoria said, the words coming out as a harsh whisper. "They wouldn't take a simple custody case. Their retainer alone would be in the 7 figures. "They are representing her pro bono," Richard said, and his words confirmed her deepest, most unbelievable fears. Pro bono. For free. Victoria's mind raced, discarding possibilities as fast as they appeared. This did not compute. It violated every law of the universe she understood. Power attracted power. Money attracted money. A penniless waitress did not attract the pro bono services of one of the most prestigious and morally unimpeachable law firms in the country. It was like a stray dog being adopted by a king. "Why?" Victoria demanded, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "Why in God's name would they be interested in her?" "I don't know, Victoria," Richard admitted, and the admission of ignorance from him was more alarming than anything else. "But it gets worse. They haven't just filed a notice of representation. They've already filed a counter-motion and a request for an immediate injunction against us. They're claiming our custody petition is a frivolous and malicious action intended to harass and intimidate. They are accusing Blackwood Industries of attempting to use its financial power to perpetrate a de facto kidnapping based on socioeconomic discrimination." The legal jargon was a smokescreen for the brutal message beneath. They were not just defending Jasmine, they were attacking Victoria. They were painting her as a corporate bully, a wealthy monster trying to steal a child from his loving, impoverished mother. And they were doing it with the kind of legal firepower she had thought was reserved only for herself. "This is not a simple waitress. Victoria," Richard continued, his voice grim. "Someone else is involved. Someone is backing her. Someone with immense resources and a very specific agenda." After she hung up the phone, Victoria walked to the great window of her office. The city spread out below her, a glittering web of light and power that she had always seen as her own. But now, for the first time, it felt different. It felt hostile. The thousands of windows in the buildings opposite her seemed like eyes watching her. Jasmine Washington was not her adversary. Jasmine was a pawn, a front for some other unseen player. Who was it? A business rival she had crushed a decade ago, seeking revenge, an old family enemy she had forgotten. The questions swirled in her mind, a vortex of paranoia and uncertainty. The clean, simple lines of the problem had become a tangled, impenetrable mess. Jasmine's final words came back to her, no longer sounding like a desperate boast, but like a chilling prophecy. "There are things about me, about Adrienne, that your investigators haven't found." Her confidence, so absolute just hours before, began to hemorrhage away, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. She had thought she was the one holding all the cards, playing a game of overwhelming force. Now she realized she was playing a different game entirely. A game of shadows and secrets against an opponent she couldn't see. For stakes she was only just beginning to understand. And she had no idea what the rules were. While Victoria Blackwood plotted her war from a throne of glass and steel, another kind of council was being held 300 feet below, in a world she could not comprehend. Jasmine Washington's apartment was a stark contrast to the sterile expanse of the Blackwood penthouse. It was small, the living room and kitchen, a single continuous space, but it was meticulously clean and filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the clanking radiator in the corner. The shelves were crammed not with ornaments, but with second-hand books, thick legal texts, worn paperbacks on economics and philosophy, and a colorful row of children's stories. The air smelled of brewing coffee and old paper. This was not a space of power, but of purpose. In the center of the room, around a small circular dining table that barely accommodated them, sat Jasmine's unseen army. To her right was a woman in her late 60s, her silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob. This was Helen Washington, Jasmine's aunt, a retired professor from the University of Chicago Law School. Helen possessed an intellect that was as formidable and unyielding as the granite of a courthouse. Her eyes, the same intelligent, determined eyes as her niece's, missed nothing. She had been the architect of this entire operation, the strategist who had turned Jasmine's grief and Adrienne's legacy into a coherent, actionable plan for justice. Across from her sat Amanda Torres, an investigative journalist in her late 30s. With a laptop covered in stickers and a perpetually cynical arch to her eyebrow, Amanda was the tip of their spear. She had made a name for herself by dismantling the reputations of corrupt politicians and exposing corporate malfeasance. She had been a colleague of Adrian's, from his brief rebellious stint in journalism school, a connection he had rekindled in the last months of his life. For Amanda, this was more than the story of a lifetime. It was a promise to a friend. The final member of their quiet council was Dr. Michael Chun, a distinguished, soft-spoken man in his 50s, a professor of business ethics at Columbia University. Dr. Chun was their moral compass and academic powerhouse. He had been Adrian's favorite professor, a mentor who had encouraged his growing disillusionment with his mother's ruthless capitalism. He had been horrified by the evidence Adrian had shown him and had pledged his expertise to the cause. On the coffee table, a stack of legal documents lay next to a half-eaten plate of cookies. It was the custody petition Victoria had filed delivered just that morning. There was no panic in the room, no fear. Only a quiet, resolute focus. Her opening move was exactly as you predicted, Amanda said, tapping a key on her laptop. Brute force. An attempt to overwhelm and intimidate with a show of legal might. Helen took a sip of her coffee, her gaze fixed on her niece. "And how did you handle your part, my dear?" "Your performance in her office must have been quite the scene." Jasmine managed a small, tired smile. "I did as we practiced. I did not engage. I did not show fear. I simply refused to accept her premise that everything and everyone has a price." She looked at the faces around the table, a wave of gratitude washing over her. "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Sitting in that room with all that power directed at me. I just kept thinking of Tyler." From the small adjoining bedroom, the sound of a child's soft, even breathing could be heard. Tyler was asleep, surrounded by stuffed animals and superhero posters, blissfully unaware of the war being waged in his name. He was the reason this room existed. He was the future they were all fighting for. Her reaction to Morrison, Caldwell, and Pierce will have been one of pure shock, Dr. Chun said, adjusting his glasses. Victoria Blackwood operates in a world of transactions. An act of principle like a major firm taking a case pro bono is a variable she cannot compute. It introduces an element of chaos into her ordered world. "My old friend Judge Caldwell was more than happy to help," Helen said with a thin, satisfied smile. "He has a particular distaste for corporate bullies who try to weaponize the family court system. He has assigned one of his best litigators to us. Victoria thinks she's in a custody battle, but she has just walked into a civil rights case." Amanda leaned forward, her expression intense. "Which brings us to our next move. While she's reeling from the legal counterpunch, we hit her from another angle. I finished cross-referencing the shipping manifests from her textile subsidiary with the internal payroll documents Adrian copied. It's exactly as he suspected. For years, Blackwood Industries has been using undocumented labor in overseas factories, violating a dozen international labor laws. The documents prove Victoria's direct knowledge and sign-off on the scheme." She turned her laptop around, showing them a complex flowchart of shell corporations and offshore accounts. "This isn't just about the custody of Tyler anymore. This is about everything. The illegal campaign contributions, the environmental violations covered up by bribed officials, the fraudulent real estate deal that displaced hundreds of families in the Bronx so she could build luxury condos." The story began to unfold, a tapestry of secrets woven over 3 long, painstaking years. This was not a plan born of a sudden revelation in a cemetery. It was a promise made by Jasmine to a dying Adrian in a sterile hospital room. She remembered his voice, weakened by his injuries, but burning with a desperate intensity. He had just discovered the full extent of his mother's corruption. He had found his grandfather's old ledgers uncovering the original sin of the Blackwood Empire, Victoria's ruthless betrayal of her own cousin Robert Blackwood, stealing his share of the company and casting him and his family into poverty. He had learned that the woman he had fallen in love with in college, Jessica, was none other than Robert's daughter. They had kept their love a secret, terrified of what his mother would do. When Jessica died giving birth to Tyler, a grief-stricken Adrian had turned to Jasmine, their closest friend. But his grief had soon turned to a cold, hard fury as he dug deeper into his mother's past, realizing she was the architect of the tragedy that had defined Jessica's entire life. He had spent the last 6 months of his life not running the company, but secretly dismantling it from the inside, copying documents, recording conversations, building a case against his own mother. "She will never believe you," Jasmine had told him, her heart breaking for the impossible position he was in. "I know," he had whispered, handing her a hard drive. "That's why I'm not going to be the one to tell her." "You are. If anything happens to me, Jazz, you have to promise me. Wait. Be patient. Learn everything you can. Build your own army. Don't move until she forces your hand. Use this to protect Tyler and to get justice. For Jessica. For her father. For everyone she's ever hurt." The car crash 2 weeks later had not been an accident. They all knew it now. Adrian had gotten too close to a money laundering scheme involving a dangerous cartel his mother had used to finance one of her projects. He had been silenced, but his voice had not died with him. It lived on in the boxes of documents stacked in Jasmine's closet. It lived on in the encrypted files on Amanda's laptop. It lived on in the quiet, determined woman who had spent the last 3 years honoring his final wish. While she worked 60 hours a week at her 2 jobs, she had spent her nights studying. Guided by Helen over long-distance phone calls, she had devoured books on corporate law, financial forensics, and litigation strategy. She had earned an online paralegal certificate. She was no longer just a waitress. She was the custodian of a stolen legacy, the quiet architect of a reckoning. "Victoria thinks you are a pawn." Helen said, her gaze soft but proud as she looked at her niece. "She has no idea that you are the queen." Dr. Chun nodded in agreement. "This is a classic case of asymmetrical warfare. She has the financial resources, the established power. But we have the truth meticulously documented and corroborated. And we have the moral high ground. In the court of public opinion, that is an incredibly powerful weapon." Jasmine looked from face to face, her aunt who had given her a spine of steel, her friend who had given her a voice, the professor who had given her a framework for justice. They were her family, a family forged in secrecy and a shared purpose. "So what is our timeline?" Jasmine asked, her voice clear and steady. The waitress was gone. In her place was a commander. Amanda answered. "We give her legal team a few days to flail. Let them realize they are completely outmatched. Let the fear and confusion build in Victoria's mind. Then on Monday, we leak the first story. Not everything at once, just a taste. The labor violations, enough to rattle her investors and trigger an inquiry from the SEC. We control the narrative. We let her react, and we stay 2 steps ahead." Helen added, "And in the custody case, we don't just defend. We attack. We file for discovery, demanding access to all of Victoria's personal and financial records, claiming they are relevant to determining her fitness as a guardian. She will fight it, of course, which will only make her look more guilty." The plan was a masterwork of legal and media strategy designed to dismantle an empire piece by piece. It was not a quest for revenge. Revenge was messy, emotional. This was colder, cleaner. This was an act of justice. After her allies had left, the apartment fell silent again. The only sound, the hum of the refrigerator and the soft breathing from the bedroom. Jasmine walked to her son's door and pushed it open a crack. In the soft glow of his dinosaur nightlight, Tyler was curled up, his face peaceful, one arm thrown around a worn teddy bear. His emerald green eyes were hidden beneath his eyelids, but Jasmine could picture them perfectly. They were Adrian's eyes. They were Jessica's legacy. They were the reason for this war. Victoria thought she was fighting to claim a piece of property, a stray heir to her dynasty. She had no idea she was fighting against a promise made to a dying man. She had no idea that her opponent was not the poor, insignificant waitress she had tried to buy, but the collective will of a son. She had betrayed a woman she had destroyed, and the friends who were determined to see justice done. Jasmine gently closed the door. The time for patience was almost over. The time for justice was about to begin. The days that followed the revelation from her lawyer were a kind of waking nightmare for Victoria Blackwood. On the surface, nothing changed. She presided over board meetings with her usual icy authority, her voice never wavering, her decisions as swift and brutal as ever. She attended a charity gala, smiling glacially for the cameras and writing a check large enough to fund the organization for a year. To the world, she was the same untouchable empress, the master of her universe. But beneath the placid, controlled surface, a storm was raging. The name Morrison, Caldwell, and Pierce had become a toxic whisper in the corridors of her legal department. Her team, the most expensive and aggressive corporate litigators money could buy, were completely stymied. They had tried to find a weakness, a chink in the armor of their opposition, and had found none. The countermotion filed against them was a masterpiece of legal scholarship, citing dozens of precedents and weaving a narrative so compelling that Richard Thornton had grimly admitted any judge would be forced to take it seriously. They were not just being outmaneuvered, they were being outclassed. Victoria's frustration mounted with every passing hour. She felt like a general with an infinite army facing an enemy who was invisible, an enemy who played by an entirely different set of rules. Who was funding this? Who was pulling the strings? Her investigators had redoubled their efforts digging into every corner of Jasmine Washington's life, but had found nothing. She was exactly as she appeared, a poor, hard-working orphan with no connections. The contradiction was maddening. It was a puzzle with a missing piece, and the void where that piece should be was beginning to look like a chasm ready to swallow her whole. The official communication arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was not a settlement offer, but an ultimatum delivered via a crisp, formal letter from Judge Caldwell's personal office. It was polite, professional, and utterly devastating. Richard Thornton read it aloud to her over a secure video link, his face a grim mask. My client, Ms. Jasmine Washington, has no interest in any financial settlement. Her only desire is to continue raising her son Tyler in a safe and loving environment, free from harassment and intimidation. Therefore, we present the following terms. 1. You will withdraw your petition for custody with prejudice, precluding you from ever filing a similar motion in the future. 2. You will cease all private investigation and surveillance of Ms. Washington and her child. In return for your agreement to these terms, my client will consider this matter closed and will not pursue any further legal action at this time. Victoria listened in stony silence, her knuckles white where she gripped the edge of her desk. The audacity of it was breathtaking. They weren't negotiating. They were dictating terms. The phrase, "at this time," hung in the air like a guillotine, a thinly veiled threat of what they were holding in reserve. They are offering you a graceful exit, Victoria, Richard said quietly after he had finished reading. A graceful exit. She hissed the words, dripping with venom. They are blackmailing me, Richard. They are holding my grandson hostage and trying to dictate the terms of his surrender. This is not a legal negotiation. It is terrorism. Their legal position is incredibly strong, Richard warned. If we proceed, they will file for discovery. They will demand access to your personal finances, your corporate records. They will turn this custody case into a referendum on your entire life, and they will do it in open court. The media fallout would be catastrophic. I have weathered media firestorms before, she snapped. Not like this, he countered, his voice firm. This is different. They are not accusing you of a corporate misstep. They are accusing you of being a monster. A rich, powerful 1%er trying to steal a child from a poor, virtuous single mother. In the court of public opinion, we have already lost. Victoria ended the call, the silence of her office pressing in on her. For the first time, she truly understood the genius of her enemy's strategy. They had bypassed the battlefield of money and power where she was invincible, and had dragged her onto a battlefield of morality and public perception where she was hopelessly vulnerable. Her pride, a force of nature that had leveled competitors and built an empire, would not allow her to surrender. She could not, would not be dictated to by a waitress and her phantom backers. There had to be a way to reassert control, to remind Jasmine Washington who she was dealing with. She decided then that lawyers and formal communications were useless. She needed to speak to Jasmine directly to cut through the legal maneuvering and face her opponent one-on-one. She still believed deep down that if she could just get Jasmine alone, she could break her. She waited until after 9 that evening. The lights of the city below were a glittering carpet of diamonds. She found the number for Bell's Diner and asked for Jasmine Washington. A gruff voice told her that Jasmine was gone for the day. Victoria then called the number for the law firm Jasmine cleaned. A night supervisor answered. Victoria used a false name, claiming to be a family member with an emergency. A few minutes later, Jasmine's voice, tired but clear, came on the line. Hello, it's Victoria Blackwood, Victoria said, her voice low and cold. There was a pause on the other end, but no sound of surprise or fear, just a quiet intake of breath. I was wondering when you would call. The calmness in Jasmine's voice was infuriating. I received the letter from your lawyers. Victoria began dispensing with any pretense. It is an amusing piece of fiction. Let me be clear. I do not respond to threats or ultimatums. It wasn't a threat, Victoria, Jasmine replied, her tone even. It was an offer. A chance to walk away from this before it becomes something you can no longer control. I am always in control. Victoria's voice rose, the anger she had suppressed for days finally breaking through. What is it you want? Is it more money? Name your price? Let's stop this ridiculous game. I already told you, Jasmine said patiently, as if speaking to a child. Tyler is not for sale. This isn't a game. You made a choice when you decided to try and take my son. Now you have to live with the consequences of that choice. Who is behind you, Jasmine? Victoria demanded, her voice a harsh growl. Who is paying for your high-priced saviors? Is it one of my competitors? Is it a political enemy? You can tell me. I will double whatever they are offering you. A soft, sad laugh came through the phone. You still don't get it? Do you? You are so trapped in your world of transactions and leverage that you cannot imagine any other motivation. You assume money is the only kind of power there is. But I am going to tell you a secret, Victoria. The truth is far more powerful, and it doesn't cost a thing. You are a naive fool, Victoria spat. The truth doesn't pay for lawyers who charge $2,000 an hour. You're right, it doesn't, Jasmine agreed. But the truth about your illegal business dealings, about how you built your empire on fraudulent contracts and systematic bribery, that truth is worth much more than money to certain people. The blood in Victoria's veins turned to ice. It was no longer a veiled threat. It was a direct, explicit statement of fact. This wasn't a guess. Jasmine knew something. Something specific. Something real. You're bluffing, Victoria whispered, but the words had no conviction. Am I? Jasmine's voice was still quiet, but now it held an edge of pure steel. You have your army of lawyers and investigators, Victoria, but for 3 years I have had my own education. I have learned that every crime leaves a paper trail. Every secret deal has a witness. Every lie has a weakness. Adrian taught me that. The mention of her son's name was a knife to the heart. You will not speak his name, Victoria choked out. I speak his name every day. Jasmine replied, her voice softening for the first time, filled with a genuine sorrow that was more cutting than any anger. I speak it to his son so that he will know what a good man his father was trying to be. A man who was horrified by what he discovered about the company he was supposed to inherit. A man who was determined to see justice done. The foundation of Victoria's world began to crumble. This wasn't about a stranger who had stumbled into her life. This was about Adrian. This was a plan he had set in motion. Her own son. I am giving you a choice, Victoria. Jasmine said, her voice becoming formal again, the commander taking charge. You can continue this war, and I promise you I will burn your kingdom to the ground. I will expose every crime, every dirty secret, every skeleton in your closet. I will not stop until your name is synonymous with disgrace. Or you can walk away, withdraw the petition, leave us alone forever, and your empire, however tainted, will remain standing. She paused, letting the weight of the choice settle in the suffocating silence. You have 48 hours to give my lawyers your answer, Jasmine concluded. The clock starts now. And then she hung up. Victoria stood holding the dead phone, the dial tone a shrill, mocking scream in the vast emptiness of her office. Jasmine had not just refused to break. She had been the one to end the conversation. She had been the one to issue the final ultimatum. Victoria sank into her chair, her body feeling impossibly heavy. She looked out at the city, at the monuments of her own success, the physical proof of her power and influence. For decades she had lived by a simple code: what she wanted, she took. Her will was an indomitable force that bent the world to her liking. Now she was faced with an impossible choice. She could have her grandson, the last link to her son, the future of her bloodline. But the price would be the destruction of everything she had ever built. Or she could keep her empire, but to do so, she would have to admit defeat. She would have to surrender to a woman she despised and walk away from her own blood. For the first time in her life, Victoria Blackwood was trapped. And the ticking of the clock in her head was the sound of a bomb counting down to the utter annihilation of her world. The 48-hour clock ticked away, each second a silent beat in the heart of two vastly different worlds. In her penthouse, Victoria Blackwood paced like a caged lioness, surrounded by opulence, but imprisoned by an impossible choice. In a small apartment across town, Jasmine Washington sat with her aunt, surrounded by legal texts, and the quiet sounds of a child's afternoon nap. The air was thick with tension, but it was the tension of a drawn bow, not a fraying rope. "Are you certain you are ready for this child?" Helen Washington asked, her voice soft but her gaze sharp, analytical. She was not questioning Jasmine's courage but testing the depth of her resolve. "If she refuses our offer, the world as you know it will end on Monday morning. You will no longer be a private citizen. You will be the face of a corporate takedown. They will dig into your life, twist your motives, paint you as a villain." Jasmine looked towards the closed door of Tyler's bedroom. She could hear him murmuring in his sleep a conversation with a dreamworld dinosaur. Her expression, which had been tight with focus, softened. "I was never a private citizen, Aunt Helen. Not from the moment Adrian put that hard drive in my hand. I have been a soldier in a war that until now was silent. I'm not afraid of the noise." Her words hung in the air, a bridge to the past. The entire conflict, which Victoria saw as a recent and sudden assault, was in fact the final act of a tragedy that had begun more than 30 years ago, long before Jasmine or Adrian were even born. It began as Helen had explained to her years ago in a boardroom that smelled of cigar smoke and ambition. A young Victoria Blackwood, then just Victoria Royce, had recently married into the family, but her ambition far outstripped that of her new husband. The company, then a respectable but unremarkable manufacturing firm, was co-owned by her father-in-law and his brother. When they passed, control was to be split between her husband and his cousin Robert Blackwood. Robert was a kind, brilliant man, an engineer who cared more for product innovation than profit margins. He trusted Victoria implicitly. It was a mistake that would cost him everything. With her husband's passive compliance, Victoria executed a masterful, merciless coup. She created shell corporations, falsified earning reports, and leveraged company assets in a series of complex predatory maneuvers that Robert, with his trusting nature, never saw coming. On the day of the final shareholder meeting, he walked in expecting to be named co-chairman. He walked out with nothing. Victoria had diluted his shares into worthlessness and legally absorbed his half of the company into her own newly formed entity, Blackwood Industries. Robert Blackwood, betrayed and bankrupted, was cast out of the family, his name erased from the corporate history. He and his young family disappeared into the quiet ruin of a life that had been stolen from them. This was the foundation of Victoria's empire, a bedrock of deceit and familial betrayal. Years passed. The story of Robert Blackwood became a footnote, a ghost forgotten by all but a few. Adrian grew up in the shadow of his mother's towering success, a prince in a kingdom built on his uncle's ashes. He was groomed from birth to be the heir, sent to the best schools, given every advantage. But the gilded cage chafed. He possessed a sensitivity, a conscience that was not his mother's. He found his escape in literature and journalism, much to Victoria's disapproval. It was at Columbia, in the dusty, quiet stacks of the Butler Library, that he met Jessica. She was not like the other girls he knew, the polished heiresses and debutantes. Jessica was a scholarship student, a brilliant artist with paint stains on her fingers and a fire in her eyes. She challenged his ideas, laughed at his inherited cynicism, and saw the thoughtful, searching man beneath the Blackwood name. For the first time in his life, Adrian was seen not as an heir, but as a person. He fell in love with a depth and totality that terrified him. For a year, their love was a secret, perfect world. They explored the city, debated art and politics in late-night diners, and dreamed of a future far from the cold shadow of Blackwood Industries. But secrets have a way of unraveling. It happened one evening when Adrian took Jessica to a gala, a rare concession to his mother's demands. A distant elderly relative of his father's saw Jessica and turned pale. "My dear," the old woman had said, her voice a reedy whisper, "you have your father's eyes. You look just like Robert Blackwood." The name dropped like a stone between them. The revelation that followed was a cataclysm. Jessica, her face ashen, confessed the truth. She was the daughter of the man his family had destroyed. Her childhood had been one of constant struggle, her father, a brilliant but broken man haunted by the ghost of his stolen legacy. She had known who Adrian was from the beginning, but had fallen in love with him, despite it never imagining it could be anything more than a fleeting, impossible romance. Their secret world was shattered, replaced by a terrible, tragic inheritance. They were the children of a bitter family feud, a real-life Romeo and Juliet. They knew with absolute certainty that Victoria would never approve. She would see Jessica not as the woman her son loved, but as the ghost of her greatest sin, a threat to her carefully constructed narrative of success. So they deepened their secret, their love now forged not just in passion, but in a shared, defiant rebellion. Jasmine was their confidant, the keeper of their secret, the one person in the world who knew about the quiet apartment. They shared a small pocket of normalcy in a life of lies. Then came the pregnancy, a source of both terror and profound joy. This child, their child, would be a bridge between the two shattered halves of the Blackwood family. They would tell Victoria, they decided after the baby was born. When she could see her grandchild hold him in her arms, surely her heart would soften. It was a desperate, youthful hope, and it was never to be tested. The childbirth was difficult. There were complications, a sudden hemorrhage, a frantic rush to the operating room. Adrian stood in the hallway, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling his lungs, his world shrinking to the frantic beeping of machines. He heard his son's first cry, a sound of miraculous life. Minutes later, a doctor emerged, his face a mask of exhaustion and pity. Jessica was gone. The grief was a physical thing, an ocean of pain that threatened to drown him. He was left with a tiny, perfect, motherless son, and a secret that was now a crushing, solitary burden. He and Jasmine named the boy Tyler, a name he and Jessica had chosen together. Jasmine, loyal and heartbroken, stepped into the void, becoming Tyler's surrogate mother, her own life put on hold to honor the memory of her best friend. It was in the months that followed, as Adrian sorted through Jessica's meager belongings, that his grief began to curdle into a cold, focused rage. He found his great-uncle Robert's old journals filled with details of Victoria's betrayal. He saw in his dead father-in-law's handwriting the proof of his mother's crime. The abstract family story became a concrete, documented act of evil. He realized that Victoria had not just ruined a business rival. She had destroyed Jessica's father, and in doing so had stolen from Jessica a life of security and peace. He saw his mother not as a brilliant titan of industry, but as a predator who had devoured her own family to feed her ambition. That was when the prince became a spy. Using his access as the heir apparent, Adrian began to dig. He worked late into the night, not managing the company but investigating it. What he found was worse than he could have ever imagined. The betrayal of Robert Blackwood was not an isolated incident. It was the blueprint for his mother's entire career. He uncovered a pattern of bribery, corruption, and exploitation that spanned decades and continents. He copied files, recorded conversations, and traced laundered money through a web of offshore accounts. He was building a case, not just for Robert and Jessica, but for every person his mother had ever crushed on her ascent to the top. The final scene, the one that was seared into Jasmine's memory, took place in her apartment 2 weeks before the crash. Adrian arrived late, his face pale and grim. He looked older, the youthful optimism gone from his eyes, replaced by a weary hardness. He placed a single encrypted hard drive on her kitchen table. "This is everything," he had said, his voice low and urgent. "Proof of every crime, every lie. It's all here." He looked at her, his eyes pleading. "Jasmine, I've stirred up something ugly. The money laundering scheme, it's connected to some very dangerous people. People she's used before. I think they know I'm getting close." "Adrian, you have to stop," she had begged, a cold fear gripping her. "Go to the police." He shook his head. "I can't. Not yet. They'll bury it. She has judges and politicians on her payroll. The system she's corrupted can't fix itself. It has to be torn down from the outside." He pushed the drive towards her. "If something happens to me, this is Tyler's protection. It's his justice. And it's Jessica's." He gripped her hands, his own cold as ice. "Promise me, Jazz. Don't move. Don't do anything until you have to. Until she forces you. Wait. Be patient. Use this time. Learn. Get stronger. She will underestimate you. That will be your greatest weapon. Promise me you will wait for the right moment, and when it comes, you will not hesitate." She had promised. 2 weeks later, she was identifying his body at the morgue. Back in the present, Jasmine opened her eyes. The weight of the past of that promise was as real as the table beneath her hands. "I'm ready," she said to Helen, her voice clear and absolute. "Adrian gave me a mission. For 3 years I have prepared. Victoria has just given me the reason to execute it. This is not about revenge for me. It is about fulfilling my promise to the dead. It is about creating a world for Tyler where the sins of his grandmother cannot touch him." Helen nodded slowly, a deep, fierce pride in her eyes. The student was ready. The architect had done her job. All that was left was to watch the building fall. The 48th hour passed, not with a bang, but with a whisper. It slipped away at 9 o'clock on a Friday evening, marked only by the chime of a grandfather clock in the cavernous hall of Victoria Blackwood's penthouse. She had spent the final hours of the ultimatum in a state of defiant, cold resolve. She had not called her lawyers. She had not made any attempt to contact Jasmine. She had chosen silence. To Victoria, this inaction was a declaration of strength. It was a refusal to acknowledge the legitimacy of the threat. She, Victoria Blackwood, did not negotiate with terrorists, and she certainly did not bow to the ludicrous demands of a waitress. Her entire life had been a testament to the principle that power, when faced with a challenge, must be asserted, not compromised. She had weathered storms before. This was just another squall born of a foolish girl's emotional delusions. She had called the bluff. She slept soundly that night, convinced that she had won. The weekend was a pristine, orderly affair. Victoria reviewed quarterly projections, attended a private viewing at a modern art gallery, and finalized plans for the demolition of a historic building to make way for a new 50-story glass and steel monument to her own power. The matter of her grandson and his unfortunate guardian had been relegated to a problem for her legal team to solve through brute methodical force. The threat, she believed, had been neutralized. Monday morning dawned crisp and clear. Victoria rose at her customary hour of 5, her routine as unvarying as a law of physics. She completed her workout in her private gym overlooking the waking city, read the international financial papers on her tablet, and dressed in a tailored suit of armor gray silk. By 7, she was in her Bentley, gliding through the arteries of the city toward the heart of her empire. She felt a familiar surge of satisfaction as the Blackwood Industries Tower came into view, its spire piercing the morning sky, a testament to her indomitable will. The first sign that the world had tilted on its axis came at precisely 8:15 a.m. David Chun entered her office without knocking, his face a pale, strained mask she had never seen before. In his hand he held a tablet, and he held it as if it were a venomous snake. "Victoria," he said, his voice a strangled whisper, "you need to see this." He placed the tablet on her desk. It was open to the homepage of the Metropolitan Journal, the city's most respected newspaper. The headline, in a font size usually reserved for declarations of war, was a brutal, shocking blow. "Empire of Lies. Leaked documents expose decades of corruption at Blackwood Industries." Below the headline was a photograph of Victoria, a candid shot from the previous week's gala, her smile a cold, predatory slash. But it was what was beside the photo that made the blood drain from her face. It was a scanned image of an internal memo dated 12 years prior. It was a directive to the company's chief financial officer outlining a strategy to conceal losses through a series of offshore shell corporations. At the bottom, clear as day, was her own elegant, imperious signature. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She scrolled down. It was a deluge, an avalanche of proof. There were excerpts from a secret ledger detailing illegal payments to foreign officials. There was an email chain, time-stamped and authenticated, in which she personally authorized the suppression of a report on environmental contamination at one of her manufacturing plants. There was a link to a secure online portal where the public could view hundreds of pages of source documents, fraudulent contracts, falsified safety inspections, internal communications about union-busting activities. This was not an accusation. It was a meticulously documented vivisection of her life's work laid bare for the entire world to see. It was Adrian's promise, fulfilled with devastating surgical precision. The phones began to ring, a cacophony of alarms, signaling the complete and total implosion of her world. Her private line, the stockbroker from Morgan Stanley, his voice frantic. "Victoria, it's a bloodbath." Trading on BWX was halted at the opening bell. "The SEC has launched a formal investigation. The market is in freefall." Her office line, the CEO of a rival corporation with whom she was negotiating a merger. "Victoria, the deal is off. We can't be associated with this. Don't call us again." Her mobile phone, Richard Thornton, his usual calm, shattered. "Victoria, the feds are here. The FBI and the IRS. They have a warrant for the entire building. They're seizing everything. All our servers, all our files. It's over." David was frantically fielding calls from panicked board members and department heads. The news was everywhere. Victoria turned on the large television screen mounted on her wall. Every major news network was leading with the story. Her face was plastered across the screen next to images of exploited factory workers and polluted rivers. Financial analysts, their faces grim, spoke of the biggest corporate scandal in a generation. The name Blackwood, once a symbol of untouchable power and success, had become a synonym for crime and corruption in the space of a single hour. In Jasmine's small apartment, the scene was one of quiet, somber vindication. She, Helen Amanda, and Dr. Chun sat around the small kitchen table, the same television news playing on a small second-hand set. There was no champagne, no celebration. They watched the fall of the House of Blackwood, not with glee, but with the grim satisfaction of surgeons who had just completed a painful but necessary amputation. They had known this storm was coming. They had unleashed it. But seeing the sheer scale of the destruction was a sobering, awesome thing. Amanda's phone buzzed incessantly with calls from every major newspaper and network in the world, all wanting an exclusive. She ignored them all. The documents spoke for themselves. The climax arrived shortly before noon. The live news feed switched to a helicopter shot of the Blackwood Industries Tower. At the base of the building, a swarm of dark blue jackets was flooding the pristine marble lobby. FBI, IRS, federal agents armed with warrants and grim determination were pouring into the heart of her empire. The camera zoomed in on the chaos. Employees were stumbling out, some in tears, clutching boxes with their personal belongings. Reporters were shouting questions, their cameras flashing like strobe lights. The camera found a familiar figure. David Chun, his suit immaculate but his face ashen, was trying to reason with an FBI agent presenting a useless piece of paper, likely a motion to stay the warrant. The agent, a tall, implacable woman, simply shook her head and gestured for her team to proceed. David's shoulders slumped in defeat, the final, loyal soldier of a fallen queen. From her perch high above the city, Victoria watched it all. She was strangely, terrifyingly calm. The panic had subsided, replaced by a cold, hollow numbness. It was as if she were watching a film about someone else's life. The building below the company that bore her name, the empire that was an extension of her own soul, it no longer felt like hers. It was a carcass being picked apart by vultures on live television. Her bank called. A clipped, professional voice from the private wealth division informed her that, pursuant to an order from the United States Treasury Department, all of her personal and corporate assets had been frozen pending the outcome of a federal investigation into money laundering and tax fraud. Hundreds of millions of dollars, the numerical representation of her life's work, had vanished with a single keystroke. She stood and walked to the window, looking down not at the street but at the reflection of her own face in the glass. The powerful, untouchable woman she had been that morning was gone. In her place was a stranger, a woman whose name was now shorthand for disgrace. She had made her choice. She had refused to surrender her grandson, and in doing so had lost everything else. Her pride had demanded a war, and her enemy had responded with annihilation. The sirens began to wail in the distance, a rising, mournful chorus growing closer. She knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the marble floors beneath her feet that they were coming for her. The fortress was breached. The queen was alone in her tower, and the walls were closing in. The sirens were no longer a distant, mournful cry. They were a physical presence, a screaming, pulsing vortex of sound that converged on the base of the tower and clawed its way up the sheer glass face of the building. Victoria stood before the window, watching her own reflection as the blue and red lights of the emergency vehicles painted strobing, frantic patterns across her face. The calm numbness had begun to recede, replaced by a strange, ethereal detachment, as if she were a ghost, haunting the final moments of her own life. She heard the telltale chime of the elevator, a sound she had always associated with her own ascent, now signaling the arrival of her conquerors. It was a private elevator, accessible only by a keycard and a biometric scan that responded to her touch alone. They had overridden it. The thought, a small technical detail, was somehow more violating than the public evisceration of her company. They were inside the fortress. The heavy glass doors to her office suite hissed open. She did not turn. She continued to look at her reflection at the city sprawling behind it. She saw them in the reflection, first 4 men and 1 woman, all dressed in dark suits, and the iconic blue jackets of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They moved with a quiet professional purpose, their faces grim and unreadable. The lead agent, the tall woman she had seen on the newsfeed, stepped forward. "Victoria Blackwood," the agent asked, though it was not a question. Victoria turned slowly, her movements measured, almost regal. The muscle memory of a lifetime of command was a hard thing to kill. She met the agent's gaze, her own eyes cold and empty. "I am Victoria Blackwood." The agent held up a document. "I have a warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, mail, fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to defraud the United States government." She began to recite the formal words of the Miranda rights, the familiar litany from 1,000 movies and television shows, now a surreal, suffocating soundtrack to the end of Victoria's world. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Victoria barely heard the words. They were noise, irrelevant static. Her mind was a maelstrom of fractured images, the headline in the journal, the plummeting stock ticker, the sight of her employees fleeing her building. She felt a bizarre impulse to correct the agent's grammar, to critique her delivery. It was a reflex of a mind that could not accept the reality of its own powerlessness. "Please place your hands behind your back," the agent said, her voice polite but firm. For a moment, Victoria did not move. It was an involuntary, instinctual act of defiance, the last twitch of a dying monarchy. One of the male agents took a step forward, his hand resting lightly on her arm. The touch was electric, a shocking intrusion into the personal space no one had dared to violate in 30 years. She flinched, and in that flinch, the last vestige of her authority crumbled to dust. She complied, turning and placing her hands behind her back. The click of the handcuffs as they closed around her wrists was a small metallic sound, but it echoed in the cavernous office like a gunshot. It was the sound of finality, the sound of a cage door swinging shut. She felt the cold, hard steel against her skin, and a wave of nausea washed over her. She, who had metaphorically held the world in her hands, was now physically bound. As they began to lead her from the office, her gaze fell upon her personal mobile phone lying on the corner of her vast empty desk, and then it rang. The ringtone was a gentle classical melody, a piece by Vivaldi, an island of serene beauty in the harsh, ugly reality of the moment. Everyone stopped. The agents looked at the phone, then at Victoria. It was a number she did not recognize. "Let it ring," the lead agent said, starting to move her forward again. But Victoria stopped. "Wait," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. She did not know why, but she had a sudden, absolute certainty that she had to answer this call. It felt like a summons, the final piece of a puzzle she still did not understand. She looked at the agent, a silent, desperate plea in her eyes. The agent hesitated for a heart-stopping second, then gave a curt nod to another agent who picked up the phone and put it on speaker. "Hello," the agent said. "I would like to speak to Victoria Blackwood," a calm, familiar voice replied. It was Jasmine Washington. The lead agent's eyes narrowed, but she gestured for Victoria to respond. "I'm here," Victoria said, her voice barely audible. The sound of her own name felt foreign, the name of a person who no longer existed. "I know this is not a good time," Jasmine began, and the understatement was so profound it bordered on cruelty. "But there is one last thing you need to know. Something Adrian wanted you to know. I am telling you this because it is the final part of my promise to him." Victoria's breath caught in her throat. Adrian. The name was a fresh wound, a source of agony so deep it overshadowed even the humiliation of her arrest. What more could there be? "You believe your son died in an accident." Victoria Jasmine continued, her voice filled not with triumph but with a deep, chilling sadness. "A tragic random event. But there are no random events in the world you created. Only consequences." Victoria could feel the blood draining from her face, a cold tide of dread pulling her under. The agents around her were silent, listening intently. "The last time I saw Adrian," Jasmine said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, as if she were reliving the memory, "he was terrified. He had uncovered the full extent of the money laundering scheme you were running through the Riverside project. It was not just about offshore accounts and tax evasion. He found out who your partners were. A drug cartel. People who do not forgive mistakes and who do not tolerate loose ends." Victoria's mind flashed back to a series of meetings to shadowy men with foreign accents and cold eyes. Men her financial advisors had warned her against, but whose river of illicit cash was too tempting to refuse. They were just business partners, tools to be used. problems to be managed. He told me he was being followed. Jasmine's voice trembled with remembered fear. He said he had found proof that they were using your shipping company to move their product. He was going to expose them, and you along with them. He was gathering the last of the evidence. Her voice broke for a moment, a single sharp note of pain. He never got the chance. The pieces began to fall into place in Victoria's mind, forming a picture of such monstrous, unbearable horror that her sanity began to fray at the edges. The brakes on his car didn't fail, Victoria Jasmine said, her voice now clear and devastatingly direct. They were cut. The police report called it an accident because your partners have people on their payroll everywhere, even in the city morgue. But it was an execution. They silenced him. Victoria made a sound, a low, strangled gasp of denial. No, it was not possible. Do you understand what I am telling you? Jasmine's voice was relentless, forcing the truth into the gaping wound of Victoria's denial. The men you hired, the criminals you got into bed with to make yourself a few extra $1 million, the dangerous people you used to solve your problems, they killed your son. They murdered him to protect the criminal enterprise you created. Your greed, your corruption, your ambition. It wasn't a business deal, Victoria. It was the price of your own son's life. The world did not go black. It shattered. The revelation was not a thought or an idea. It was a physical force, a white-hot spear of agony that pierced through her heart, her soul, her very being. Adrienne, her son, not lost to a tragic accident, but murdered. Murdered as a direct, inevitable consequence of her own actions. The sins of the mother visited upon the son in the most brutal way imaginable. Every memory of him was instantly, horribly recontextualized. His teenage rebellions were not against her authority, but against her corruption. His distance in his final years was not youthful independence, but a horrified retreat from the monster he had discovered his mother to be. His death, the central tragedy of her life, was not a cruel twist of fate, but a bill that had come due, a debt she had incurred that he had been forced to pay with his life. She was not just a disgraced CEO. She was not just a criminal. She was the architect of her own son's murder. A sound tore itself from her throat, a sound of such profound animalistic pain that the seasoned federal agents around her took an involuntary step back. It was not a scream. It was the sound of a soul breaking. The strength went out of her legs. Her body, no longer governed by her will, simply gave out. She collapsed to the floor, a heap of gray silk and shattered humanity. The handcuffs bit into her wrists as she fell. She was vaguely aware of the agents rushing forward, of hands grabbing her arms, but the sensations were distant, meaningless. Her universe had been reduced to a single, unbearable point of light. The image of her son's face smiling at her from a childhood photograph, a face she had created, cherished, and ultimately destroyed. The last thing she heard before a merciful blackness swallowed her whole was Jasmine's voice, quiet and final, through the still open phone line. Now you know the truth. May God have mercy on your soul. 2 years is a lifetime. It is long enough for empires to be forgotten, for wounds to scar over, and for new worlds to be built upon the ashes of the old. In the silent, monotonous world of the Millbrook Federal Correctional Institution for Women, 2 years was an eternity, measured in Bell's headcounts and the slow, grinding erosion of a former self. Inmate number 77431, formerly known as Victoria Blackwood, moved through her days with a quiet, ghost-like emptiness. The woman who had once commanded boardrooms with a single icy stare now scrubbed floors in the prison laundry, the harsh smell of industrial bleach, a constant acrid perfume. Her hands, once soft and manicured, were now raw and calloused. Her tailored silk suits had been replaced by a drab, ill-fitting khaki uniform. Her world, once a panoramic view of a conquered city, had shrunk to the dimensions of a 6-by-9-foot concrete cell. The fall of the House of Blackwood had been total and absolute. The trials had been a media sensation, a public spectacle of corporate greed and its consequences. But Victoria had been a strangely passive defendant. The fight had gone out of her in that final, horrifying moment in her office. The revelation of her culpability in Adrienne's death had been a blow from which her soul would never recover. She had confessed to everything, her voice a monotone, her eyes vacant. The legal battles were fought by her court-appointed attorneys. Her personal fortune, once thought limitless, remained frozen and ensnared in a web of civil lawsuits and federal seizures that would take decades to untangle. She was sentenced to 25 years, to life, a term that at her age was a death sentence. But the court's judgment was a pale shadow of her own self-imposed punishment. Prison was not her true sentence. Her sentence was the memory of her son's face, a memory that played on a constant, torturous loop in her mind. Every night she would lie on her thin mattress staring at the gray ceiling, and she would see him. She would see him as a boy, his green eyes bright with a life she had ultimately extinguished. She would hear his laughter, a sound she had been too busy to cherish. And she would feel the weight of her sins, a crushing physical presence that left no room for hope or peace. The other inmates, women hardened by lives of violence and poverty, gave her a wide berth. They did not see a fallen billionaire. They saw a ghost, a woman haunted by something far more terrifying than prison bars. While Victoria's world had shrunk to a concrete box of regret, another world 100 miles away had blossomed. In a quiet, tree-lined town in Connecticut, in a rambling white house with a wide porch and a sprawling green lawn, a new legacy was taking root. This was the world that Jasmine Washington had built. After the trials, the courts had moved to untangle the original sin of the Blackwood Empire. The fortune that Victoria had stolen from Robert Blackwood, which had grown exponentially over the decades, was legally separated from Victoria's corrupt enterprise and placed in a trust for its sole living heir, Tyler Blackwood. With Helen Washington as a co-trustee, Jasmine became the steward of a considerable but clean fortune. She did not, however, move into a palace. The house was large but not ostentatious, chosen for its proximity to good schools and the peace of the surrounding woods. It was a home, not a statement. Jasmine herself was transformed. With the financial security the trust provided, she had left her 2 jobs and enrolled in law school full-time, finishing at the top of her class. She now worked for a non-profit organization, one funded by a grant from her own trust that provided legal aid to low-income families facing eviction and foreclosure from predatory corporations. She had taken the weapons of the powerful and turned them into shields for the vulnerable. She was no longer a waitress. She was an advocate, a warrior for the people Victoria had spent her life crushing. Tyler, now 6 years old, was the sun around which this new world revolved. He was a bright, happy, and loving boy, his life a testament to the healing power of a stable and nurturing home. The shadows of his past did not touch him. He knew his mother Jessica had been a beautiful artist who had gone to heaven when he was born. He knew his father Adrian had been a kind, brave man who loved him very much. Jasmine told him stories every night, stories of his parents' secret love, their courage, their dreams for him. She was building a mythology for him, a foundation of love and honor, to counteract the tainted legacy of the Blackwood name. One crisp autumn afternoon, Jasmine sat on the porch steps, watching Tyler and his great-aunt Helen in the yard. Helen, her silver hair bright in the sun, was teaching him how to properly hold a violin. It was a small, child-sized instrument, a gift for his 6th birthday. "No, sweet boy," Helen said, gently adjusting his bow. "Let your wrists be loose. Like this. Let the music flow through you. Your father was the same. He was always so serious, so tense. But when he played, he was free." Tyler concentrated, his small brow furrowed, and drew the bow across the strings. The sound was screechy, imperfect, but it was a beginning. He looked up at Jasmine and grinned, his emerald green eyes so like his father's, sparkling with pride. In that moment, the contrast between the 2 worlds could not have been more stark. In a prison cell, a woman was haunted by the memory of the music her son once played. Here, in a sun-drenched yard, that music was being reborn in the hands of his child. The fortune was not just for them. Jasmine had systematically worked to turn the Blackwood name from a symbol of corruption into a force for good. The Adrian Blackwood Memorial Scholarship sent a dozen underprivileged journalism students to Columbia every year. The Jessica Blackwood Arts Grant funded community art programs in underserved neighborhoods. A large anonymous donation from their trust had saved the hundreds of families in the Bronx from the very development project that had been the catalyst for Adrian's murder, converting the site into a public park with a playground. Jasmine was not just managing money. She was performing an act of restorative justice. With every scholarship granted, with every family saved, she was cleansing the legacy, honoring the good that Adrian and Jessica had represented, and erasing the stain of Victoria's greed. That evening, after Tyler was asleep, Jasmine and Helen sat in the quiet living room, a fire crackling in the hearth. "Amanda called today," Helen said, looking into the flames. "There's a production company that wants to make a documentary about the Blackwood case. They are offering a great deal of money for your cooperation." Jasmine shook her head without hesitation. "No. The story is over. It belongs to the court records now. My story, our story, is the one we are living here. It's private. I agree, Helen said, smiling. Some things are not for sale. Jasmine looked around the room at the comfortable furniture, the finger paintings by Tyler taped to the walls, the photograph of a smiling Adrian and Jessica on the mantelpiece. They had won, but their victory was not in Victoria's imprisonment or the seizure of her wealth. Their victory was in this peace. It was in the sound of a little boy's laughter, in the freedom to live an honorable life, in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that they had built a family on a foundation of love and truth. Victoria Blackwood had lost her empire, her freedom, and her son. She was left with nothing but the bitter ashes of her choices. Jasmine Washington had started with nothing but a promise, and from that promise she had reclaimed a legacy, raised a son, and built a world filled with love, purpose, and a quiet, unbreachable peace. It was a fortune of a kind that Victoria Blackwood, even in the height of her power, had never come close to possessing. 3 years after the fall of the House of Blackwood, on a morning crisp with the promise of late autumn, Jasmine Washington drove north, leaving the gentle tree-lined comfort of her new life behind. The journey was a pilgrimage into the past, a deliberate step back into the world of coldstone and hard lines she had fought so hard to escape. The Millbrook Federal Correctional Institution was a scar on the landscape, a sprawling complex of gray concrete and gleaming razor wire that seemed to suck the very color from the sky. Jasmine had never been here before, yet it felt intimately familiar, the final grim chapter in a story she had been forced to write. Her decision to come had not been made lightly. It had been born from a child's question, a question so simple and yet so profound, it had echoed in her heart for weeks. Tyler, now a thoughtful and curious 7-year-old, had been looking at the single-framed photograph Jasmine kept on her desk. It was of his father Adrian, a handsome, smiling young man with kind emerald eyes. Mama, Tyler had asked, his own identical eyes looking up at her. "You said my father's mother is away, in a quiet place. Is she a bad person?" Jasmine had chosen her words carefully, as she always did when speaking of the past. She made some very bad choices, sweetheart. Choices that hurt a lot of people. Tyler had absorbed this, his small brow furrowed in thought. Then he had asked the question that had prompted this journey. But can bad people become good people? The query was a testament to the world Jasmine and Helen had built for him, a world where redemption was possible, where goodness was a choice, and where love was the ultimate transformative force. It was a world that had no place for permanent monsters. And Jasmine knew with a sudden crystalline clarity that she could not answer his question for him, but perhaps she could create a space where one day Victoria Blackwood might. The visiting room was a sterile, soulless place painted in a pale institutional green that seemed designed to sap all hope. A thick pane of plexiglass, scratched and cloudy with 1,000 sad encounters, separated the visitors from the inmates. Jasmine sat on a hard plastic stool, her hands resting on the worn counter. She was dressed in a simple but elegant navy blue suit, the quiet armor of her new life as a lawyer and advocate. When the door on the other side opened, Jasmine felt a jolt, a phantom echo of the fear and intimidation she had once felt in this woman's presence. But it faded as quickly as it came. The woman who entered was not the Empress Victoria Blackwood. She was inmate 77431. The years had been merciless. Victoria's hair was now completely gray, cut in a severe, unflattering crop. Her face, stripped of its expensive cosmetics and professional defiance, was a roadmap of grief and regret. The famous icy blue eyes were dull, haunted. She wore the same drab khaki uniform as every other woman in the room, a final, brutal erasure of her former identity. Victoria sat down, her movements slow, weary. She looked at Jasmine through the plexiglass, her expression a mixture of shock and a deep, ingrained suspicion. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice a rusty rasp from disuse. "Have you come to gloat, to see how the mighty have fallen?" "No, Victoria," Jasmine said, her voice soft. She picked up the receiver of the crackling intercom system. "I have not come to gloat." Then why? Victoria's gaze was hard, a faint ember of her old fire. "There is nothing for you here." "I think there is," Jasmine said. "I came because of Tyler." At the mention of his name, a flicker of something pain, yearning, a profound and bottomless sorrow passed across Victoria's face before she masked it again. "The boy," she said, her voice flat. "I trust you are enjoying the fortune you schemed to acquire." Jasmine let the bitterness of the remark pass without comment. It was a shield, a pathetic, crumbling wall against a pain she could not bear. Tyler is happy, Jasmine said simply. He is kind and bright, and he is starting to look more like Adrian every day. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a small stack of photographs, sliding them one by one into the metal slot at the base of the divider. The first was a school picture. Tyler in a neat blue blazer was grinning a gap where his two front teeth used to be. The second showed him standing next to Helen, both of them proudly holding up a lopsided but recognizable clay sculpture of a dog. The third showed him on a sunny lawn, his eyes closed in concentration, drawing a bow across his small violin. Victoria stared at the photographs. Her hand, gnarled and raw from her work in the laundry, trembled as she reached out to touch the surface of the last picture, her fingers tracing the image of her grandson playing the instrument his father had so loved. She did not speak. She could not. A thick, painful knot was forming in her throat. His music teacher says he is a natural. Jasmine continued, her voice gentle. He has a gift, just like his father. She paused, letting Victoria absorb the images, a vision of the life that was continuing, the legacy that was growing in a world far from this gray, hopeless place. He started asking questions about you. Victoria finally looked up, her eyes swimming with an unshed ocean of tears. What did you tell him? She whispered. I told him the truth in a way a 7-year-old can understand it. I told him you were his grandmother, and that you made very big mistakes that hurt people, and that you are living in a quiet place now to think about those choices. Jasmine leaned closer to the plexiglass. He asked me if bad people can become good people. He wanted to know if you could. The question hung in the air between them, a fragile, impossible bridge across the chasm of their history. It was a child's simple, profound query about the nature of redemption, and it was directed at the one person in the world who felt she was beyond it. Victoria finally broke. A single hot tear escaped and traced a path through the weary lines on her face. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, a gesture of raw, unpracticed emotion that reminded Jasmine of their first meeting in the cemetery so long ago. And what did you tell him? Victoria asked again, her voice thick with a pain that was almost unbearable to witness. I told him that I believe everyone has a choice every day to be a little better than they were the day before, Jasmine said. I told him that what he knows of you in the future is not up to me. It is up to you. Jasmine stood up, her part in this finished. She had not come seeking an apology or a confession. She had come to deliver a message, a seed of possibility from a grandson to a grandmother he had never met. A chance not for parole or for freedom, but for a different kind of salvation. She left the photograph sitting in the slot on Victoria's side of the glass. He is a good boy, Victoria, she said, her final words soft but clear over the intercom. Jessica and Adrian would be so proud. She turned and walked away without looking back, leaving Victoria Blackwood alone with the images of her grandson, the ghost of her son, and the unbearable, terrifying, and perhaps ultimately hopeful question of whether a person, even one as broken as herself, could ever choose to be good. Jasmine stepped out of the prison and back into the bright, clean air of the free world. She took a deep breath, the last ghosts of the past finally fully exorcised from her soul. The war was over. The promise had been kept. The legacy had been reclaimed. That evening, back in the warm, fire-lit living room of her home, Tyler ran to her, his violin in his hand. Mama, I learned a new song. Can I play it for you? Of course, my love, she said, sinking into a comfortable armchair. He stood before her, his small body straight and proud, and began to play. It was a simple, familiar tune, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. The notes were not all perfect. The rhythm was a little shaky, but the melody filled the room with a sweetness and a purity that was more valuable than all the money in the world. As she listened, Jasmine looked at the photograph on the mantel, at the smiling faces of Jessica and Adrian, and she knew with an unshakable certainty that they could hear it too. Victoria Blackwood had tried to buy a grandson to possess a legacy. But she had discovered far too late that a family cannot be bought. It must be built. It is built with presence, with sacrifice, with courage, and with a love that is unconditional. It is a structure forged not of steel and glass, but of the infinite strength of an unpurchasable heart. In the end, this story serves as a powerful reminder that true wealth is not measured by the figures in a bank account, but by the strength of our character and the love we build in our lives. Victoria Blackwood had an empire of money, but lost everything because she lacked a foundation of human decency. Jasmine Washington started with nothing but integrity and a promise, and with it, she built a priceless legacy for the next generation. It shows us that underestimating someone based on their station in life is a perilous mistake, and that the most powerful force for change in the world is often a quiet, determined heart fighting for what is right. If this story of justice, resilience, and the true meaning of family touched your heart, we hope you will join our community. Your support helps us to continue bringing stories like this to light. Please consider leaving a like to let us know it resonated with you, and subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next chapter in our collection of tales that inspire and remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Thank you for listening.